Wonderful. Well, I wonder how many of you have picked up this story of a woman called Frances Connolly. Does that name ring any bells to anyone? Frances Connolly? Well, a picture will come up on the screen. Frances Connolly, keep saying that wrong, her and her husband won the £115 million Euro Millions lottery. They won all that money. And an article was written on her recently about how she has already given half of it away. Like £60 million of this win she's given away. And she said in her words in this BBC News article that she can't help it. She is addicted to giving, addicted to helping. Now, sometimes when someone wins £150 million, we think about giving half of it away and we think they've still got £60 million left. It doesn't quite hit home. But let me help bring this home for us this morning. Here's some examples of what Frances could have done with this money had she not given it away. Could she have bought one of the most expensive cars in the world? Yes, friends, she could have done. And not just one, but 24. 24 of the most expensive cars in the world. Could she have bought a castle? Should be a castle. I mean, that would be a stretch, right? Friends, she could not only just buy a castle, she could buy 17 castles. What about a private island? Who would like a private island when it's raining in England right now? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'd think maybe 60 million would stretch to buying a private island. It would stretch to buying 2 private islands. Now, kids, some of this stuff may be a bit meta for you, so I'm going to bring it down, hopefully, into some language that you can understand. It would also mean that she could have bought 120 million cream eggs. 120 million cream eggs. Who thinks they could eat 120 million cream eggs? No, absolutely. It could be 240,000 Xboxes, which is enough, it's almost enough to give every single person in Nottingham an Xbox. Pretty cool, right? It would be, I mean, this one I thought was cool. You could have 10,000 trips to Disney World in Florida, which I worked out, folks, would mean that you could go to Disney World every week until you're 191. Isn't that cool? It's a big deal to give away half of that money. 60 million pounds, a lot of money. It's a big deal to give away half of everything we have. Imagine you did that this afternoon. Everything you owned, everything you had, you gave half of it away. It's not normal. And yet, in our story today, that's exactly what happens with Zaccheus. Zaccheus, when he meets Jesus, when he has this encounter with Jesus, his response is many things, but one of his tangible responses, one of the things he does is gives half of everything he has away. Why would he do that? Why would you do that? Well, it's because he found something more valuable than money. He found Jesus. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, though, I think. So let's go back just a step. Who's heard this story before of Zaccheus climbing the tree? Absolutely, wonderful. It's a well-known story, and a couple of things we need to know in order to get the impact of this story is that Zaccheus was a tax collector. And it won't be a surprise to hear that, I mean, tax collectors aren't very popular today, are they? But particularly in the first century, tax collectors were not popular at all. And we hear that Zaccheus wasn't just a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector, which means that he was the boss probably of many other tax collectors. And the reason that tax collectors weren't popular, not even that they weren't popular, they were hated in society, is because they defrauded and stole money from other people. They took more than their fair share. Not only that, most of the tax collectors in this time would still have been Jewish, but would have worked for the Romans, and the Jews didn't like the Romans. Okay? That's what you need to hear. So when a Jewish person starts working for the Romans, it's like they're working for the enemy, like the worst enemy. And so Zaccheus was not a popular person. He was a tax collector. He was seen as a traitor in his society for working for the Romans, and he'd walk around and everyone would see their pockets and their wallets and their money getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and Zaccheus would walk around town with even nicer clothes and even nicer possessions. And because of this is the second thing I want us to know, because of this, Zaccheus wouldn't have had many friends, if any. Imagine not having any friends. No one who asks you how you are. No one who wants the best for you. You're completely alone. You may have all of this money, but you don't have anyone in the world. And so when Zaccheus comes to see about Jesus, just as we saw in the cartoon, he would have been shoved away probably. You know, people who saw Zaccheus probably would have been muttering under their breath all kinds of horrible things, probably just loud enough for him to hear them too. And yet Zaccheus is so desperate to see Jesus, he climbs this tree, being a short man. Anyone had to climb a tree because they're too short before? Don't really have to do that these days, do we? No, okay. But Jesus, surrounded by all of these crowds, so with all of this busyness around him, looks up into the tree and he sees Zaccheus. The person who everyone else hates. The person who's on the outside of all the friend groups. Jesus sees him. And not only does Jesus notice Zaccheus, he begins to speak to him and he calls him out of the tree and says, I want to have dinner with you. Now this would have been a huge shock to the crowds. And not just to the crowds, but probably to Zaccheus too, right? Jesus wants to associate with me? The crowds would have been thinking, but Zaccheus is a traitor, he's a sinner, he's a bad guy, he's defrauded us. And yet Jesus, with all these crowds around you, he's the one you pick out. What is going on? And this is at the heart of who Jesus is. Jesus sees the worst of us. Sees all of the bad things we've done, all of the things that we're not proud of, and he loves us anyway. That's what he's trying to show us through Zaccheus. He takes the person who's the worst, one of the worst people you could think of, and Jesus sees him and loves him. You know, the same is true of us. This is one of the really simple truths of the gospel, this good news about Jesus, is that Jesus sees each one of us, all the good bits, and all of the bad bits. And he still loves us. He still loves us anyway. And so Jesus asks Zaccheus to come down from the tree and asks to eat with him. But when Zaccheus meets Jesus, he's so moved it causes him to give everything away. Now, I've had dinner with some nice people. I've had dinner even with some inspirational people. Never have I had dinner with someone who makes me want to give away half of everything I have. Why did Jesus have this? Why did Zaccheus do this? Because Jesus, in this moment, Zaccheus sees something in Jesus, doesn't he? That says Jesus isn't just normal. He's not just another man. He's not just a good figure. He's not just an inspirational figure. In that moment, Zaccheus sees something about Jesus, something that reflects who he really is. That Jesus is God. That Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah. That there's something different about him. And what happens for Zaccheus when he encounters Jesus, when he meets with Jesus, is total transformation. He doesn't just change his heart. He doesn't just think, I'm maybe going to change my attitude on a few things. He changes his actions. He changes his entire lifestyle. He gives away half of everything that he's had. And this is what happens to us as well when we meet with Jesus. Everything can change. And I want to emphasize this point because there are lots of things in the world today that might be able to change the way that we think. You know, I'm not a big podcast person, but I feel like I have a friend every week who tells me they found the best podcast ever, and it's changed the way that they think about this or that and the other, and that's amazing. But there's lots of things that might change the way that we think. There's some things even that might change certain behaviours. Might change whether we go to the gym or not. Might change how we eat or our diet. There are very few things in the world that change our whole lives. That from the moment that we encounter them, change the way that we live. When Zaccheus met Jesus, when he encountered Jesus in this moment, he suddenly realized that Jesus was worth more than anything he had. Anything he could own, anything he could possess. Zaccheus could have won the Euro Millions jackpot and would still have given it away happily, I'm sure, if Jesus had asked him to. For Zaccheus, it started with his life being changed around his generosity, but it would have transformed his whole life. And this is what happens as well, by the way, when people meet Jesus today. I've seen people who have met with Jesus and it's like they're a different person, a new person, because meeting with Jesus changes them. I think about my friend Tony from my old church. I remember the first time Tony walked into the church, he went straight up to the leaders at the front and he said to them, these were his first words, exact words, he said, I'm a very difficult person. So how do you respond to that at the end of a church service? What do you say? Thank you? That's okay? I don't know. I'm a very difficult person. And then he began to sob. And it turned out that he had come into the church that day and he had encountered something of the love and the goodness of God, and it began to change him. And as I got to know Tony over several years, whole attitudes, whole ways that he lived his life began to shift. He used to tell me I was so angry all the time. I used to judge people, and I used to always look to get my own back, and now I just want to be compassionate to people. I want to love people even when they've wronged me. He said, I spent my whole career trying to get one over on people, trying to one up other people in my profession. And now I don't want to succeed if it means someone else being hurt. The whole way that he viewed life, the whole way he viewed himself and those around him began to change, because this is the effect Jesus had. It's not just about giving away money, but changing the whole way that we are in the world. And just like Francis Colony, who became addicted to helping, believe it or not, we can become addicted to Jesus. When we encounter him, when we meet with him, there's nothing else we want more than him. Amen.